In recent years, life in Portugal has become far more difficult than it might seem at first glance. Just 10 years ago, a square meter of housing in Lisbon cost around €1,000. Today, it's twice as much. Over the past decade, prices have risen by more than 250%, and in 2022 alone, housing became another 20% more expensive. In major cities, renting a simple one-bedroom apartment now requires earning at least twice the minimum wage. Rent can reach €2,000 a month, a burden that's already unbearable for most Portuguese families. Portugal is facing a triple crisis: housing, economic, and social. And in recent times, an immigration crisis has joined them, though it looks different from what many expected. In September 2024, massive protests shook the country, some of the largest in its history. Thousands of people took to the streets, not against the government this time, but against a new wave of newcomers, tourists and wealthy foreigners buying up property. The irony is painful. For years, tourism was the main engine of Portugal's economy. Last year, 1 in 10 Portuguese worked in that sector, and so-called digital nomads brought billions of euros annually. But for many locals, this boom turned into a trap. People who grew up in these neighborhoods are being forced to leave their homes, or work as cleaners in houses that once belonged to their families. To understand how Portugal reached this point, we need to look back. After the fall of the dictatorship in 1974, the country was essentially starting from scratch. While other European nations were already building strong economies, most Portuguese lived on meager wages, the equivalent of less than €9 a day today. By the 1990s and early 2000s, things began to improve. European funds financed new roads, bridges, and infrastructure projects. Cities were modernized, and life seemed to be stabilizing. But beneath the surface, an old problem remained. Portugal never developed a competitive industrial base. It failed to create enough stable, well-paid jobs, and instead leaned more and more on services, especially tourism. Between 2000 and 2005, revenue from tourism nearly doubled, from €6 to €11 billion. The Algarve, Lisbon, and Porto became magnets for travelers, and Portugal turned into an affordable paradise for Europeans. But when the 2008 global financial crisis hit, it struck Portugal like a brick wall. Without strong industry, the country was left on the verge of collapse. By 2011, Portugal was forced to accept a bailout, €78 billion from the IMF and EU. Unemployment soared, construction froze, and the government desperately needed a quick fix. That's when it turned to a familiar recipe: tourism, but with a new twist. In 2012, the Golden Visa program was launched, granting residency to foreigners in exchange for investment. The idea sounded promising: attract wealthy investors to boost the economy. And it worked, at least on paper. The scheme brought in over €7 billion. But it also unleashed a wave of real estate speculation. Wealthy investors bought up properties, often leaving them empty or reselling them again and again at higher prices. As a result, housing prices in major cities skyrocketed by more than 250%, while wages barely change. For most citizens, owning a home became an unreachable dream. From 2010 to 2024, the number of tourists visiting Portugal more than doubled. A country of just 10 million people was welcoming around 18 million visitors every year. Tourism now accounts for roughly one-fifth of the entire GDP, about €60 billion annually, one of the highest ratios in Europe. But this dependence came at a price. Entire neighborhoods where local families once lived have turned into blocks of short-term rentals and trendy cafes for tourists. Tourism created hundreds of thousands of jobs, but most of them are low-paid and seasonal. The average salary in the sector is about €1,000 per month, barely enough to cover rent in big cities. In the Algarve, hotel and restaurant workers often can't afford to live near their jobs and must travel hours each day from cheaper rural areas. The profits from tourism mostly go not to workers, but to those who own the land, hotels, and rental properties. It's no surprise that Portugal now has one of the highest levels of wealth inequality among developed countries, and tourism only deepens that divide. Short-term rentals have flooded the housing market. By 2020, over 11% of urban housing was dedicated to tourists. In Lisbon's historic Alfama district, more than 60% of buildings had been converted into vacation apartments. Combined with the Golden Visa program, which brought tens of thousands of wealthy foreigners, this triggered unprecedented price hikes: 57% in Lisbon, 61% in Porto, and over 50% in the Algarve in just 4 years. Ironically, the issue isn't a lack of housing. Portugal actually has one of the highest housing-to-household ratios in Europe, about 1.4 homes per family. The problem is that many of these homes are empty or unaffordable. In 2023, one-third of all property sales in Lisbon were made by foreigners, and by 2024, a third of the city center's buildings stood unoccupied. Meanwhile, construction of new housing remains painfully slow. Only 11 new homes are built per thousand residents over an entire decade. Bureaucracy, zoning laws, and environmental restrictions further choke development. The result: exploding demand, limited supply, and soaring prices. In a country where half the population earns less than €1,000 a month, life in big cities has become practically unattainable. The minimum wage is just €840, while rent for a one-bedroom apartment in Porto already exceeds €1,100. No wonder over half of Portuguese aged 25 to 34 still live with their parents, not by choice, but by necessity. This isn't just about comfort, it's a symptom of a deeper demographic crisis. Birth rates have fallen to 1.3 children per woman, one of the lowest in the world. Since 2010, the population has been shrinking. Schools in rural areas are closing, villages are emptying out, and the younger generation is leaving for other EU countries in search of a better life. The influx of tourists and wealthy foreigners has made life in Portugal increasingly unaffordable for its own citizens. Yet instead of reversing this trend, the government has doubled down. In 2022, it launched a special visa for digital nomads, remote workers with tax benefits and a lower cost of living. But to qualify, one must earn at least €2,800 per month, 3 times the average local salary. This policy only attracted even more high-income foreigners, pushing prices further out of reach for locals. Foreign capital is not just buying homes, it's also buying the country's key industries. Energy, transport, insurance, some of Portugal's most valuable assets are now owned by corporations from Beijing, New York, or London. At first glance, these deals may seem beneficial. The government gets quick cash, and jobs are preserved. But the deeper consequence is that profits no longer stay in Portugal, they flow abroad. Critical decisions about the nation's future are being made not in Lisbon, but in distant boardrooms. And so, the country once celebrated as a European paradise is now becoming a place where its own citizens can barely afford to live. Housing and energy prices keep breaking records, wages stagnate, and the foreign capital that was supposed to save Portugal is instead fueling a social disaster. The protests sweeping across the country are not just about housing. They're a cry for help, from a society that feels its homeland slipping out of its hands.